This episode is brought to you by Sacred Rites, which provides support, resources, and networks for religion scholars committed to translating their research to a broader audience. You can find more information about their work at sacred-rites.org. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. On this episode, I am delighted to welcome Dr. M.K. Long to the show. M.K. Long is a historian and ethnographer of Buddhism and gender. She is currently visiting lecturer on women's studies and South Asian religions at the Women's Studies and Religion program at Harvard University. Her home institution is Dartmouth University's Department of Religion. Her current project, and the topic of our conversation, highlights vernacular autobiographical writings of Buddhist women in Myanmar, examining their rhetorical strategies of self-presentation and how they theorize Buddhist authority, temporality, and belonging. Long's study of vernacular literature in the 1980s and 90s foregrounds its conditions of production, not only its relationship to Buddhist biographical and narrative traditions, but also authoritarian censorship, state-driven reorganization of monastic institutions, and shifting citizenship regimes. This work is shaped and informed by Long's ethnographic fieldwork in a large mission-oriented nunnery in downtown Myanmar in Yangon, and its network of branch nunneries throughout the country. Without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. M.K. Long. Dr. M.K. Long, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
I'm delighted that you're here. I'm wondering if we can kick this off by having you just introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners out there so they know a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. So my name is M.K. Long. For the past 3 years, I've been teaching as a lecturer in the religion department at Dartmouth College, where I get to teach classes on Buddhism, other religions too, Buddhist literature, religion and ethnography, Buddhism and gender, all kinds of fun things like that. This coming year, actually, I have a new opportunity. I will be a fellow in the Women's Studies and Religion program at Harvard Divinity School. And
Very
I'm
cool.
excited.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much. I'm especially excited for that opportunity because it will return me to HDS, where I did my master's in Buddhist studies, which was a really formative experience in my academic journey. From there, after my master's, I did my PhD training at Cornell University in the Asian Studies program there. Again, another very influential place with a great group of people who I learned so much from. All of these experiences led me to an academic career where I get to do great research in Southeast Asia, primarily in Myanmar, where my work has so far focused on communities of Buddhist nuns, who in Burmese are known as Tilashin. So these women are not fully ordained, like many of their male monastic counterparts, but they are women living renunciant lives and reinterpreting monasticism in very interesting ways. And so because of working with them, the kinds of questions I bring to my work relate broadly to Buddhism and gender, and also Buddhism and literature, and particularly literature in Burmese from different parts of the 20th century, all different genres where Buddhism, monasticism, and women are either the central topic or kind of in the background too.
Yeah, I noticed in your bio on your Dartmouth website that you study vernacular literature of the 80s and 90s. I'd love to know a little bit more about your academic journey. Like, why did you come to care about these things? Do you have any like major turning points in your journey that kind of made you have those aha moments?
Well, I would say that particular aha moment came very late in my career because I began studying the Burmese language pretty late in my training. Before that, but the story of how I got there, I think to me, it's not no longer a surprise to me that that's where I landed. I started out studying religion as an undergrad at Smith College. But even though Smith has this really incredible Buddhist studies program, I was completely oblivious to it for my first 3 years of college. It wasn't until my senior year that I even thought about taking a class on Buddhism. And I did it in a really fun and interesting way, which was to sign up for the 5 college program in Buddhist studies, which included a January term study abroad program at a Tibetan university in India.
Hmm.
It was the first time I had ever been to Asia, the first time I had studied Buddhism. And I found that experience completely life-changing. I ended up returning to India after I graduated from college. And that sort of combination of travel and study became really exciting for me. After my a few months in India, when I ran out of money, I needed a job, and I was lucky enough to get a job with a study abroad company, leading a study abroad program in Bhutan. And so I started to kind of expand my understanding of the Buddhist world, at different kinds of Buddhist communities, different issues that living Buddhist communities are dealing with, including questions of Buddhism and violence, Buddhism and politics. So as I was working for this study abroad program, I realized I wanted to get more into back into the study and research. My role was more a kind of support person, managing health and wellness and that kind of thing for groups of undergraduate students studying abroad. But I really wanted to be back in the classroom myself. Um, and the first thing I had began to realize is that if you want to study Buddhism and in graduate school, you have to study Buddhist languages. And at the time, I was convinced that that was primarily these ancient languages like Sanskrit and Pali or classical Chinese. Um, and so I was convinced at that point that these ancient languages were the key to learning what there needs to be known about Buddhism. And I had a bit of temporary amnesia about this whole experience I just had with all these, living Buddhist communities who certainly make reference to things written in those languages, but don't speak with them on a daily basis. Um, so I set about learning Pali, and then after a little while, kind of picked my head up out of the sand too, thanks to some really good teachers, and said, oh, I should also learn a language that people are still speaking and writing in today. And it was sort of a coincidence that a Burmese class was being taught that I got to join in, and that really kind of kicked off this whole new set of questions and possibilities for what I could do with my research.
Mm. How did you, once you had the Burmese aspect, how did you get interested in what nuns do in Myanmar?
Yeah, the question of um, all along in my academic journey, I not only was talking to colleagues and teachers, but also to my family. And my mom raised me. She was like a staunch second wave feminist, always asking, and what are the women doing? Where are the women? What are they up to? And so that voice was always in the back of my head. And I would come home spouting these ideas about Buddhist scriptures and treatises and ethical ideals and abstract philosophical principles. And she would just say, and what are the women doing? And not that I resented that question at all, but it was this constant reminder to think about how do people actually live out these ideals and philosophical ideas that I was encountering in these textual sources? And so largely it's thanks to my mom, conversations with my own mom, who always encouraged me to think about the ways that ordinary people were dealing with and negotiating, navigating, reinterpreting these key ideas. So she is why I decided to sort of get more deeply into the study of Buddhism and gender. And with these Burmese language skills, I thought, oh, I could go and see what it's like to live in a nunnery, to be part of a community like this. So that's how it started.
Perfect. You sent me a piece of work that you have out right now. I believe it's from the Journal of Religious Ethics. Is that
That's
correct?
right. Yes.
Excellent. The piece is called Rebirth and Perfection in Ordinary Lives, Biographical Writing and Vernacular Religious Ethics in 20th Century Myanmar. Tell me a little bit about the origin of the project and what drew you to the specific nunnery and person that you profile.
Sure. Well, when I was at Harvard Divinity School, I had the privilege to study with a scholar, Professor Janet Gyatso. She works primarily with Tibetan Buddhist texts and communities, but some of her most influential work has been on the power of biography in the Tibetan context. And so at that time, I was thinking, wouldn't it be so interesting to bring some of the questions that Professor Gyatso was asking with Tibetan biography into the Myanmar context? And specifically, I wonder if I could find biographies of Buddhist nuns and see what they're like, how they work, what kinds of stories they tell about Buddhist nuns' lives. When I presented this idea to someone else in my academic world there at Harvard, who had some experience in Myanmar, they told me, oh, there's no such thing as a Burmese biography of a Buddhist nun. Nuns are not respected enough in Myanmar to warrant having biographies written about them. And, I was very early in my graduate study at that point. I didn't know for sure. I had very little experience of that world myself. And so part of me, was crushed. Oh, I guess I better find a new project. But the other part of me was really motivated to prove that wrong. I thought, and had some other colleagues say, well, that can't just be, that can't be right. You can prove that wrong. And so this was always in my mind that I'm going to see if I could find biographical writing about Buddhist nuns. And so when I started doing some trips to Myanmar at last and practicing my beginner Burmese, I would go around to bookshops and booksellers and ask, do you know of any books about Buddhism written by women? And I would usually get some laughs and smiles and would be, handed some interesting things along the way, but no biographies. Now, in the middle of my dissertation fieldwork, the pandemic started and I was grounded and, left Myanmar and was back home and started to do some more research and translation since I could no longer do my day-to-day fieldwork as I had initially imagined it. And there is a university in Yangon, in Myanmar's biggest city, called the Theravada Buddhist Missionary University. And they have a really excellent online catalog of texts that they've digitized from their collection. And you can search that collection in Burmese. And even though I didn't have any titles in mind or specific authors in mind, I just typed one day into the search bar, the author name search bar, the female honorific in Burmese, the word do, so which is like saying Mrs. or something, or a sort of just the prefix for a woman's name. And so once I typed that word into the author search bar, everything written about Buddhism by a woman that they had digitized from their catalog popped right up.
Fantastic.
And I just thought, why didn't I do this 2 years ago? But I didn't know. I didn't know about the resource. I didn't have the wherewithal to just pop it into a library search. So, these things happen at particular moments when you're thinking in a particular way and you have a skill set continues to grow. So these things are always gradual. So in retrospect, I feel like this was something I could have figured out much earlier, but that's the moment that happened. But so then as I began searching through those materials, lo and behold, I did start to come across biographies. And that's where I encountered this volume of biographies from the Khemethaka nunnery. And in a couple of other places too, I had found some, one-off short biographies, biographical essays, other kinds of collections of writing about women. But I thought it was a super interesting example of biographical writing because it's 4 biographies, or it's 3 biographies and 1 autobiography, all collected together. And it's shaped by the biographies are of the first 4 head nuns of a particular nunnery in central Myanmar, in a town called Sagaing. And so I realized, this isn't just, the story of one life. This is also an institutional history. These 4 connected lives tell the story of the formation of this nunnery, its foundation, and the way that leadership passed along to 4 generations of teachers, all at an extremely interesting period of Burmese history too. So its story, the founder's biography begins with her birth in the 1860s. And then it narrates their lives and the life of the nunnery up into 1982 when it was published. Mm. So a really interesting and intimate glimpse of an institutional history, family histories unfolding across much of the 20th century. Looking at experiences from the colonial period, the independence period, up into the 70s and 80s under the socialist government. So many interesting historical changes narrated through the growth of this particular institution. Now, my overall project has looked at each of these 4 life stories in turn. But the reason that I'm writing about, in this particular piece, about the story of Gunawati, who is the 3rd of these 4 teachers, is because of how intensely some parts of her story are narrated. And that's really strikes me as exciting and interesting because much of her story is narrated through dialogue, very emotional dialogue. But the biographer, Gunawati's student, wasn't there for any of this. So it's a really interesting example. It's biography, but there's also an element of fiction or imagination, some other kind of creative approach to narrating the emotional force of these scenes that I was really drawn into and raised a lot of questions for me about what the biographer is doing too, not just about, the basics of this life story, but why is it being told in this particular way? What did the biographer really want to get across? And what was her goal in narrating her teacher's story like this?
Mm. Yeah, and there's another term in your subtitle here, vernacular religious ethics. And I want to know a little bit about that. This is obviously a non-canonical text. Tell me a little bit about why texts like this are important for understanding Buddhist ethics in general.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I think in a really basic way, when we think about vernacular, it's like, okay, the way that people speak on a daily basis, their normal patterns and habits of speech. But more often than not, when we think about ethics and religious ethics, we often turn to writing that's explicitly about how to be a good person, instructions. And I say this to my students sometimes when in their daily lives, when they think about how to be good, how to make hard decisions, how to improve themselves, they don't crack open Kant's critique of pure reason. They don't look to an abstract philosophical text. They talk to their friends. They call their parents. They, look at someone who they admire and they think, what would they do? How would they talk about this? What kind of decision might this other person who I know and trust make? And so I think when the approach that I want to bring to religious ethics is and to Buddhist ethics in particular, is way more in that vein of what kinds of conversations are people having or thinking about when they make hard decisions and when they want to grow and become a better person. And I think as scholars, and again, this comes down to this kind of power dynamic between these scriptural languages and these everyday languages that Buddhists actually live with and use on a daily basis. What's really interesting is that some of these really special, powerful key terms from those scriptural languages have also become part of everyday speech. And so when they get used over time in lots of different contexts, they seem to kind of accrue more and more meaning. And they start to mean different things to different people and get used and deployed in different ways. And so, when I was, reading this volume of biographies, I would come across these terms that were familiar to me from my more sort of scriptural training. And I, my first habit would be, oh, I know what that means. I read about it in that scriptural text. But then the more I would see it being used as part of an ordinary scene of everyday conversation, the more I started to question, do I actually know what this word means here? It's doing something that I didn't expect.
Mm.
And I think this is partially also because this was all happening in my practice of translation, where I'm really going word by word, phrase by phrase, slowly moving through translation. I was picking up on things I otherwise would have ignored if I was just reading in my native language. And so I think the fact that I was translating and in a time of still actively working on expanding my Burmese vocabulary and my understanding of grammar really forced me to always question myself. Do I actually know what this means? And how can I figure it out? So whether that was in conversation with my language teacher or, texting with my friends who are nuns and saying, when somebody says this, what do they mean? Like having that kind of conversation, trying to get not just the meaning of the word, but the meaning of the scene in which the word is being used. And through that process, I began to think, oh, this is a different approach to Buddhist ethics than the kinds of questions that I've brought to my studies of Buddhist ethics in the past. Can I articulate that as a method that's helpful for other people too? When we're reading other kinds of texts that tend to get less attention from scholars of Buddhism.
Mm. There's another concept in the piece that jumped out at me that I've never talked about on the show. It's pāramī. Well, how do I say this term, and what is this?
Yeah, pāramī.
Pāramī.
Yep. So this is one of these really key terms across Buddhist traditions and across Buddhist languages. It takes different forms in different languages. But so this were one of the sort of most ubiquitous and familiar ways that it's used. It basically means ethical perfection. And it comes to mean that because in the Buddhist textual tradition, there are 10 particular qualities that have to be perfected in order to become a Buddha. Now, there's lots of conditions for becoming a Buddha, but these 10 qualities are really key. Now, there's this really great tradition of biography of the Buddha that includes not just the life that he lived as Siddhartha Gautama, where he's a prince growing up in a palace who leaves his family behind to renounce and seek enlightenment. That's just his last lifetime. In many collections, there's over 500 stories of his previous lives too, where he is gradually, painstakingly working towards becoming a Buddha. And in some of those lifetimes, he's not always the best person, or he's not always doing everything right. He is capable of mistakes. Now, in the traditions associated with Buddhism in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia that we tend to call the Theravada tradition, the last 10 of these life stories are the most important. And each one of these 10 is associated with a story of the Buddha perfecting a particular quality. So these 10 qualities are generosity, virtue, renunciation, wisdom, effort, patience, truthfulness, determination, compassion, equanimity. So all these things, when you think of them, you think, yeah, that makes a great person.
Yeah.
And it's really, some of these stories though are really ambivalent. Like sometimes it's like in perfecting that quality, the Buddha goes totally overboard. So like the story of perfecting generosity is one of the most famous stories in the Buddhist world, where the Buddha gives away his wife and children because he's being generous. Somebody just comes and asks, can I have your kids? And he says, sure thing, of course you can have my children. And so, and there's lots of different ways this story gets told, and lots of different elements of tragedy, humor, it can be kind of narrated in so many different ways. But ultimately, it's like a really shocking story where is this really what it takes to become a Buddha? Is this really what perfection looks like? So these 10 qualities, these 10 paramis, that's like the sort of key way that when you see that word parami, you think those 10 qualities. Now, I kept coming across this word in these biographies of Buddhist nuns, and where it had nothing to do with these 10 qualities. It said, it was saying something about, oh, this person has what it takes to become a successful monastic. But that, even just that sense of having what it takes didn't really seem to me to capture what the term was doing. And so that's what diving into the effect of using this term, especially for women, that's where this work came out of.
Yeah. Where do you see this project going next? Like, what are some of your goals for future research in this area to keep highlighting the stories of these women that that are the center of your work?
Yeah, I think this is a little piece of this project that I think has legs to do more with, specifically related to reinterpreting this term pāramī, is that very often in Buddhist context, you'll encounter this idea that being born as a woman, being born into a female body, is karmically inferior to being born into a male body. And so when I say karmically inferior, I mean that being born into a female body means that in your past lives, you weren't as good, weren't as morally, sufficient as somebody who gets born into a male body. And this is like so common, in fact, that you'll even hear people like Buddhist nuns say, oh, in my next life, I hope I'm born a man, because that'll mean I'm in a better position. Partly it just comes from the fact that the Buddha became a Buddha in a male form. And so the assumption is that you have to be a man to become a Buddha. So whether or not that's the case, and different Buddhist traditions disagree about that, there is this general assumption that karma, that female karmic embodiment is inferior to male embodiment. But I think with this idea of pāramī and the fact that this sort of transformation that people undergo, ethical transformation across hundreds, thousands of lifetimes, it means that karma doesn't always work the way we think it does or want it to. It's hard to see, it's hard to map. So there are ways that Buddhists seem to be kind of maximizing all the mysteries involved in this cosmic past to women's advantage. To say, oh, all of this, the way that she's leading her life now, today, it's not because she's trying to not conform or she's trying to be different. She's trying to, mess things up for her family. It's because she's just living out this process that was set in motion lifetimes ago. And if you get in her way, you're going to disrupt this even more. So I think there's something about that unknowability of that deep cosmic past that isn't, that it's sort of shifting that karmic logic around to empower women rather than to make them feel inferior. And I think that looking for that logic in other ways, which might show us more to aspects of the Buddhist tradition that do get used to debase women rather than empower them.
Fun question. What is a fun fact that you want for everybody to know about the life of Dao Gunawati?
Oh, a fun fact. Wow. I mean, it's like such a broad question because like so many of these women go through so much hard stuff. But I think one of the most powerful scenes of her life is that her biographer narrates that when she's an infant, so part of her story is that her father, who's never named in her biography, he's kind of an absent father. But when she's 1 year old, he tries to come back and take her away from her mother. And the scene in the biography is so intense. She is in her cradle, wailing, crying, as a 1 year old would if a stranger came and picked her up. So very relatable. I have children who often cry their brains out when picked up by strangers. So anyways, this scene, the fact that she's wailing in the arms of this man, this strange man who's trying to take her away from her mother, her great grandparents are there, and they say this is how they kind of keep her with them. They say that she's not your daughter. She's our daughter reborn. Mm. So she's her own grandmother who had recently passed away, reborn. She doesn't belong to you. She belongs to us. And so in this scene, not only does the infant stay with her mother and her, extended family, her great grandparents who help raise her, they also manage to turn her into their heir. They have 10 children, but they pick, instead of any of their own children, they choose their great granddaughter, this infant, to be their sole heir. And it's all of the money and property that they leave her when they die that allows her to become a nun. So this is a really fun, I would say fun, although very, intense and dramatic. A really interesting story about how a story being told, a life story being told in this very intense and emotional way has very material effects on the resources that she can harness, the way that she uses those resources to then shape her life going forward. And it's because of that money and property that she brings with her that this nunnery gets established.
Fantastic. Well, where can folks follow along with your work if they want to, see what you do next and follow along in the future?
Um, wow, nowhere right now. Sorry.
I disagree.
Oh,
Religion.dartmouth.edu.
oh, sure. Okay. So I have a bio page on the Dartmouth website. And I hope to have more of this work out in the world very soon. My plan is to not only publish my book manuscript, my analysis of these stories, but also a full translation of this
Mm.
volume of biographies, because there is just so little writing by Asian Buddhist women themselves that's been translated and distributed. So one of my big goals for this project is to have this full translation available for people to learn from their stories.
That would be amazing. And when you finish up that translation and it's coming out in the world, please come back on the show
Okay, I'd love
and we'll
to.
talk again. Dr. M.K. Long, thank you so much for chatting about rebirth and perfection in ordinary lives, biographical writing, and vernacular religious ethics in 20th century Myanmar, out now from the Journal of Religious Ethics. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.